In recent weeks, we've been asking a number of different people who they think Jesus is. Well, that's one way of looking at it, isn't it? We asked the believers in the Old Testament who they thought Jesus was, who was to come. What had God told them about the coming Jesus event? We've asked those who were present at Jesus' birth and the events immediately following that. Who is Jesus? We've looked at the testimony of shepherds and wise men. We've looked at comments made by angels to Joseph and to Mary. We've asked Jesus himself, who do you think you are? And this week we're coming to another group of people. It's those who lived at the time of Jesus. The people who actually saw him walk upon the earth, who heard what he had to say, who witnessed his life. Where better can we go to ask the question, who is Jesus, than the eyewitnesses to the events associated with Jesus' life? So this morning we're looking especially at how people who first encountered Jesus responded to him. Now, as the weeks pass, we will also ask some of the disciples who saw all the events associated with Jesus' life and death and resurrection, his ascension into heaven and the gift of the Spirit, and who then wrote about what they'd experienced. We will be asking them, who do they think Jesus is? But now we're asking those who first encountered Jesus, what did they make of him? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that they had 4 different reactions, or 4 sometimes overlapping reactions to who Jesus is. The first is, when they met Jesus, they recognized in Jesus a human being just like themselves. You remember that story? I think it's a lovely story in John's Gospel, in John chapter 4, where Jesus is travelling with his disciples, and he is the first one to get tired. And he sends them off to get some food to eat and to come and bring it back so that they can have a meal together and so that he can be recharged. Jesus knew what it was to get hungry and tired. Jesus knew the pains and sufferings that we sometimes experience in our mind. The sense of loss. You remember how he wept at his friend Lazarus' tomb? You remember too, above all, that suffering that he felt upon the cross when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, there's a certain form of Christian teaching that suggests that you and I should always be buoyant and on top of things and claiming the promises and feeling the presence of God even in the midst of the worst things that can be thrown at us. Well, it's not always true. And it's so comforting when we read Jesus say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus knew those sort of experiences. He was, frankly, flesh. If you went up and touched him, he was just like you or me. He had flesh and bones and blood and all the other bits and pieces that I don't like to look at when those programs come on television. That was Jesus. He had the body of a human being. He had the mentality of a human being. He shared the same experiences that we do. And of course, sometimes that very ordinariness was a problem. You remember that incident that is recorded in Matthew chapter 13? Perhaps it's just worth our while looking at it. Matthew chapter 13, where Jesus, right at the end of the chapter, goes back to Nazareth. Matthew chapter 13, verses 53 and through to the end. In verse 54 we're told, coming to his hometown, that's to Nazareth, he began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. As well they might be. It was one of their own who is preaching with such power. But their response is interesting. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? Aren't his brothers James? Notice there's no reference to Joseph there. Is that a little hint that there was a little bit of, he came from a one-parent family too, remember? Or at least, when his brothers and sisters came along, they tied the knot properly. Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offence at him. It was the fact that they knew Jesus so well as a human being that actually was a stumbling block in them recognising there might be anything else to him. They'd grown up with him. They'd gone to school with him. They'd been to weddings and celebrations together. They'd attended the same funerals. They'd gone out in the field to collect the crops. They'd looked after the sheep together. They knew him. Or at least they thought they did. But what they did know was he was a human being just like them. So that when people first encountered Jesus, they recognized him to be fully human. He wasn't some sort of ghostly figure that slipped in and out. Someone who was not quite tangible. Someone who was not quite human. He was fully human. And yet, there was something unique about him. And that's the second point. Actually, it comes out in that story that we've just read. There was something unique about him because he had powers and wisdom that were just unheralded in other people. They couldn't deny that. There was something unique about what he did. That puzzled them. They didn't think about it sufficiently to come up with an answer. It puzzled them and troubled them. But they knew Jesus so well that their puzzlement was overcome by the offence that he created. But he had a unique authority when he spoke. He appeared to have unique powers when he acted. And there are a couple of other things that we notice about him. You remember when those experienced fishermen on the Sea of Galilee have gone out and are caught in a storm, the like of which they themselves have not hitherto experienced. It was their own version, as it were, of a tsunami. And they're facing this storm, and Jesus walks to them on the sea. And he rebukes the storm. And the storm stops. There's no even hint in the text that it just ebbed away gradually. It is that it stopped. And the response, as it would have been if you or I had have seen it, was be, what sort of person is this? That even the wind and the waves obey him. And then, of course, Jesus was able to say to them, and who of you can accuse me of sin? When he's faced with his accusers in John's Gospel, chapter 8, in the reference in your notes, verse 46, Jesus says, "Who of you can accuse me of sin?" Now, I'm not going to ask you that question this morning, because there are all of you here will be able to come up with something that in which you deem I've failed, especially my mother-in-law and my wife. I couldn't dare stand before you and ask, which of you accuses me of sin? Because there'd be a queue to the door and all the neighbourhood would be trying to come in and clamouring in through the doors and come up with their opinions as well. So there was something unique about Jesus. Oh yes, he was human being, but there was something unique about him, and people recognised that uniqueness even if they couldn't make any sense of it. I'm not sure we would have made sense of it. When this person turns up and starts doing these sort of things, how do you make sense of it? Newspapers would have had a field day, wouldn't they? Newspapers are very quick in British newspapers to come up with words for superheroes they would have just had headlines on the front of their papers that were no headlines, because they would have not had the language to accommodate the uniqueness of this person. Some of them began to understand. You remember that story we were looking at where Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you think that I am?" We were looking at it last week, and what answer did they give? They said, well, some think this, some think that, some think the other. Some of them were ready to recognise Jesus as a prophet. Well, he speaks with such an authority and in such a way that we've never experienced it before. We've read accounts of something similar to this in the stories of our forefathers. So, he must be one of those. He must be one of those prophet figures. He must be another Isaiah, a Jeremiah, whoever it is. He must be one of them. Some of them remembered, the more theologically aware, that the Old Testament said before the Messiah comes, there will be someone else who comes first. We know the Bible story and know that person had already arrived. He was just about to start, or was now already preaching out in the desert. His name was John the Baptist. But they're asking that question, and they say, well, perhaps he's that fellow. Perhaps he's the forerunner to the Messiah. Some of them, of course, who did remember John the Baptist's ministry, said, well, John's come back to life. He's the same sort of character, isn't he? However, there were those who began to perceive him not as a prophet, but as the prophet. And they started using language of him that could only be addressed to the messianic figure who was to come. We mentioned some of them last week, those blind men just outside Jericho saying, "Son of David, have mercy on us." And John's own preaching had been, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So when people encountered Jesus, they recognized him first and foremost as a human being like them. I'm tempted to say, I wonder which his favourite football team would have been. And I'm convinced it wouldn't be Manchester United. But though there will be people in Manchester who will disagree. But he was that sort of, he was an ordinary bloke. He was a unique bloke, though. And that uniqueness began to encourage people to ask questions. Well, what does this uniqueness point us to? And they began to start using the titles of the Old Testament that referred to this great coming person that God had promised, and started to say, it must be him, mustn't it? And then as they began to try and unravel all this, some began to realise that ordinary bloke though he was also God. Now in your notes I've given you a number of verses. Matthew 8 verse 2, Matthew 9 verse 18, Matthew 14:33, and I've put etc. after it because quite literally the list could have been extended. And there are occasions in which we're told that people came to Jesus and knelt before him. That's normally what the NIV or most of the versions that we're modern versions say. They came and knelt before him. Some of the earlier versions more accurately say they came and worshipped him. For the word translated knelt is normally used of kneeling before a god. And when the New Testament writers speak of people's reaction to Jesus and say that people came and knelt before him, they only ever used kneeling when they're referring to Jesus, never to anyone else. It's as though they are saying, we recognise that when people came and knelt before Jesus, they were worshipping God. And that's how it would have been understood in the world in which Jesus lived. Now, doubtless other people came and knelt before him on other occasions and to wash his feet or whatever it was, but the Gospel writers tell us, or Matthew tells us on those number of occasions, and you could find it elsewhere in the Gospels, that folk came and worshipped Jesus. They recognised him as God, or perhaps we might say at least as a God. But we started our study this morning, or rather we preceded our study this morning, with that story in John's Gospel, that lovely story of Philip and Nathanael. And Nathanael, when presented with the mystery of Jesus, says, "You are the Son of God." Nathanael hadn't been given a lot of proof, and I've always wondered, haven't you, what went on under the fig tree that Jesus saw that was so convincing to Nathanael when Jesus gave the answer? What was going on? We're not told. Was Nathanael at prayer and praying for certain things, and or said to the Lord at that particular point, "I'd like to see the Messiah today," and Jesus turned up? We don't know, do we? We're not told. Something happened that Jesus knew about that was so uncanny that, put together with the other things that were happening with Nathanael that morning, made Nathanael, theologically aware as he was that nothing good can come out of Nazareth, convinced that he was face to face with God in a human body. Now, what we're saying very simply is this, that when people encountered Jesus, they came face to face with a human being like them, but someone who was unique. Someone who had the full range of human experiences that they did, but yet did peculiar things and said things in a way that were unparalleled in their experience. They had no sense they were meeting some sort of schizophrenic personality. They increasingly perceived that they were in the person of the Messiah. and even God himself. Now, if that's the case, if we're to listen to their testimony, and what we've done this morning is almost invite these people into our courtroom, haven't we? And said, now, tell us about your experience. And one and another have come in and they've told us something about him. And the upshot is, we've begun to grasp who those who were most enlightened began to see who he was. He was the incarnate Son of God, or as Charles Wesley says in that incredible hymn, our God contracted to a span, incomprehensibly made man. What implications does that have for you and me? Well, we ought to surely listen to what they have to say and seriously reflect upon their testimony, because if what they say is true, it raises some interesting questions for us. If he is God, then we ought to listen to him, didn't we? We might not listen to one another. We might not listen to other people. But if God has come down and walked upon this earth, we ought to listen to him. The second thing is, if God has come down to earth and lived on earth in the person of Jesus, he answers your friends' questions and the questions we have sometimes too, when we ask, what is God like? Well, he's like Jesus. And actually that answers, at least in part, one of the critical questions that people will be asking us at work this week. What sort of God allows the disaster in Japan? The answer is the sort of God who enters into this pain-torn world and shares that experience himself, who seeks to bring healing and comfort in a world that is sometimes bewildering and confusing. Now that doesn't answer all the question, does it? It can't begin to. And it may be even in glory we don't get the full answer to the question, how does God allow? How does your God, my God, allow suffering? But at least part of the answer is, he is not a stranger to the experience of the person in Japan who is suffering at the moment, nor our brothers and sisters suffering persecution in North Africa and the Middle East. He is not a stranger to those things, for he himself, as God, has experienced it. You know, one of the things I had to do when I was teaching, and then prior to that when I was first learning about the Christian faith and being trained up to be a Christian minister, was I had to be fed a whole lot of answers to things that I would end up being asked at some point. But one of the things I noticed very early on was this question, what is God like? And invariably the answers were the wrong answers. People would start by saying, God is almighty, God is this, God is that, God is the other, and he's all of those things. But actually, the Bible's answer is he's like Jesus. If you want to know what God is like, start with Jesus. Then your understanding and my understanding of God will come into focus. Won't answer all the questions, but it'll come into focus because God is like Jesus. That's why John in his Gospel, and with this I close, that's why John in his Gospel, right at the beginning, you remember in the prologue of John, says these words, not right at the beginning, no one, in verse 18, chapter 1, no one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. Now that's a rather poor translation, made him known, of a word that comes over into the English language as the word hermeneutic, which doesn't help you much either. But the word hermeneutic means is to fully reveal, to fully explain. So no one's seen God. We can't see the Father. But when the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us, John says, we saw God as fully set out before us as any human being can ever see him. Let's close in prayer. Lord Jesus, we marvel at who you are. We marvel that you should be interested in us. We are utterly gobsmacked that you, the Son of God, entered into our world of pain and suffering, of bewilderment and loss, that you might meet us in the way. And as Athanasius reminded us in that statement that John made earlier, bring us home. Only you could do that. And we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for all that you are, for the grace and the love that you've shown to us. And like those who met you in the first century, we ourselves worship He who is our God. Amen.